Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
In the past 2 weeks, both Poland and Romania have reported Russian drones flying in their airspace. Importantly, NATO forces shot down Russian aircraft for the first time in the alliance's 75-year history. Now, both countries are neighbours of Ukraine, which continues to face Russian airstrikes and ground offensives as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues. But there's a key difference between an attack on Ukraine and an attack on Poland or Romania, and that's NATO. On today's podcast, we're going to look at what makes Russian activity in Poland and Romania so different, the idea of collective defence, and some of the broader implications here.
Sam, this is a really interesting topic that we're chatting through today, and I'm really keen to learn more. But before we get into the kind of specifics of what's happened in the past week over countries like Romania and Poland, I think we need to break down a bit more about NATO to understand what it is and how it actually functions.
So here's where my mind went with this question that I knew was going to come, because this is an important part, is we could do it as a straight politics explainer, but we could also do it like we're at school, because we always say that these world leaders are kind of like kids fighting in a playground. Mm-hmm. So let's go through it in a school metaphor.
Okay.
So NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance of 32 European and North American countries. It was founded just after World War II and originally designed to counter the Soviet threat during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Now, in the playground, if you and your 31 other friends make a promise to always stick up for each other against bullies, no matter who that bully was, they basically went a bit further and promised that if someone picks on one of them, all the others will help protect them.
Okay.
Now, one important thing to remember here is that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's not in that list of 32.
Ukraine goes to a different school.
It goes to a different school. Yep. It's been actually requesting to join for a long time now. Instead, NATO classifies Ukraine as a NATO partner country, which basically means they're friends with the group in the playground. But if there's only one seat left at the back of the bus, a NATO member country is going to get it over Ukraine. But they'll kind of go into bat for each other as a general principle.
Okay, got it. So the core kind of principle of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is that an attack on one ally is an attack on all allies, but a 32-person or party, friendship or alliance, that's a lot of people. There've got to be some rules around making this work, right?
Yeah, and that's the Treaty of NATO, and we refer to the parts of that treaty as articles. And the two articles to really pay attention to today are Articles 4 and 5. Mm-hmm. So Article 4 is like when one friend thinks they're getting bullied or something worrying happens to them and they tell their friends, hey, I think we need to talk about this. So it's when one country says to all the others, I'm worried about my safety. Can we just sit down and have a discussion about what to do?
Yep.
Article 5 is the actual promise to help. That's like saying in the playground, someone has hit me, so we're all going to come and help you out now.
Okay, so Article 4 is more about maybe the perceived threat or increased aggressions, whereas Article 5 is about this has literally happened. There has been a breach of one ally, and therefore now we are all in it.
Yeah, and the really confusing part, though, is what in it means and what help means. Mm-hmm. So Article 5 says that each country will help by, quote, taking such action as it deems necessary. That basically means each country decides for itself what kind of support it provides.
Right.
So it doesn't mean that all 32 countries go to war. Some might send troops, others might offer money or diplomatic backing. It really depends on each country's own decision-making. And so in the playground, that means you could go tell a teacher or you could get directly involved in the fight.
Okay, so Article 5 then, it seems kind of almost deliberately vague in its wording to give each country their own scope to determine their response. Has it actually ever been used? Has Article 5 ever been triggered by a breach of a NATO member?
So only once, and that's remarkable since 1949, and that one time was straight after 9/11. So the US, who is a member of NATO, they didn't actually even ask for it.
Yep.
NATO's Secretary General suggested it as a show of solidarity after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And the response involved NATO surveillance planes patrolling US territory and NATO ships standing by for deployment in the Mediterranean as the closest body of water to Afghanistan. But NATO didn't actually participate in the Afghanistan invasion itself, and that's because the US preferred to work with individual countries like Australia rather than dealing with this whole alliance and this whole body.
Okay, fascinating. So it sounds more like in that instance that the NATO alliance was kind of posturing its power, this sort of aloof presence of, we have these ships, we have these planes, we're contributing to surveillance, but from a distance.
Exactly. And there hasn't been, besides that, another example for us to point to see a variation in that response.
Okay. But then in terms of Article 4, which speaks to the perception of a threat or an escalating threat, that has been invoked much more recently, right?
Yeah, well, a couple of days ago. And it was invoked by Poland after Poland alleged Russian drones violated its airspace. It's significant to invoke Article 4, but it's definitely not a dramatic escalation. Any NATO member can invoke Article 4 if they think their security is threatened.
Okay.
And interestingly, when I was looking into what that actually looks like, NATO countries meet regularly anyway. So this was kind of an agenda item to their regular meeting of we need to talk about this, and I think it went right up the top of the agenda.
Right.
But it's been used 8 times before. So Turkey has used it several times over Syria, and 8 NATO countries used it together when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. Now, Article 4 doesn't mean that any country actually has to do anything. It's just formal talks about a growing threat.
Okay, so a little more frequently used than Article 5, but still only 8 times since 1949. Yeah. It's significant, but let's now get into, Sam, what has actually happened over the past week. Now we have all this knowledge, we understand the playground politics.
Nice.
Walk me through it.
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
So we go to September 9 last week. That was when Russia launched a massive drone attack on Ukraine, and 19 Russian drones ended up flying into Polish airspace. Poland and Ukraine share a border. Poland immediately shut down 4 major airports in the country and scrambled their fighter jets. And this became NATO's real first test of working together to shoot down enemy aircraft. So Polish F-16s, fighter jets, they teamed up with Dutch F-35s, and they were backed up by Italian and German forces.
That's quite a big response.
Yeah, it was short and sharp because by the morning of September 10, NATO forces had shot down 4 of the drones. There were no other drones in the airspace.
Yep.
The rest of them either crashed or were found scattered across Polish territory.
I remember when that news story broke last week and was kind of splashed all over the TVs and news sites, and it felt a little bit scary straight away, like, oh my God, is Russia attacking Poland? But then Russia came out and kind of said, oh, these were drones that strayed into Polish territory.
Yeah, well, the foreign minister said these were groundless accusations. They had no interest in any escalation. And the defense ministry even made the point that its drones couldn't actually reach Poland because it was too far. Okay. That was all pretty easily debunked. Investigators found that the crashed drones had been fitted with extra fuel tanks specifically for the further distance.
Right.
And the wreckage had identifying features that directly tied the drones to Russia's military.
All right. So analysts then suggesting that rather than this kind of accidental straying into Polish territory, it might have been a lot more of a posturing by Russia. Is that when Poland then decided to invoke Article 4?
Yeah, it was only a couple of hours after the drones were in the air. So the Polish PM said this brought Poland, quote, the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II. NATO's boss said this wasn't an isolated incident, and the EU called it the most serious European airspace violation by Russia since its war with Ukraine began. And so late last week, NATO held talks under Article 4 at its headquarters in Belgium. And I think another way to frame that posturing idea that you're talking about is, it sounds like what a lot of the response is centered around is this idea of Russia testing the waters. What can they do that invokes an Article 4 response, but not an Article 5 response.
Because it is worth mentioning here that Putin has been a vocal critic, a long-standing critic of NATO. He repeatedly talks about, NATO threatening Russia's own self-determination, and he has threatened Ukraine with, ceasefire negotiations that they cannot include NATO membership.
He really doesn't want NATO or a NATO member on his doorstep. And so if you think about the Russian border as that doorstep, he wants NATO to be as far away from that as possible.
Right. And so that's Poland.
Yeah.
We had that happen, and this pretty, widespread condemnation from across the EU and NATO's strong language against Russia's actions. But a few days later, something very similar took place in Romania, which is a NATO member too, right?
Yeah, so over the weekend, a Russian drone flew 10 kilometres into Romanian territory. It hung around in the airspace for about 50 minutes. And this time it was Romanian and German fighter jets that tracked it but didn't shoot it down. And that's because they were worried about the collateral damage that falling drones may cause on civilian communities below in Romania. Now, Romania is a NATO country, so that's the airspace of 2 NATO countries violated in 7 days.
Okay, so a lot that's been going on. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine was several years ago now, 2022. This conflict has been ongoing. Has this kind of thing happened frequently over the course of that conflict? Are we talking about a kind of new development entirely in the course of this war?
I think a lot of people are trying to figure out in this conversation and whether this is something they should sit up and take notice to, because it's really different. And it's a bit of a yes-no answer, because since the invasion of Ukraine, NATO says there's been over 150 incidents of what they call hybrid operations in NATO territory.
Right.
And that has escalated in their frequency as the years have passed.
Okay, so I am not a military or geopolitical expert. What is a hybrid operation, Sam?
Well, neither am I, but some really helpful resources on the internet were. So hybrid operations are basically the hostile stuff that falls short of actual war. So Russia can cause damage still by these acts. It can still test NATO's responses without knowing they're about to trigger Article 5.
Yep.
So we're talking here about cyber attacks on power grids, disinformation being spread online, cutting internet cables under the sea. And they definitely all cause real problems, but they are tricky to respond to with traditional military force. It's not the kind of thing that an army can respond to quickly.
Yep.
And so, as I said before, this idea that Russia's trying to find where NATO's line is in terms of evoking a response. It is the first time, though, that drones in another country's airspace, let alone 2 other countries, has happened in such a short period of time.
Okay, so 2 breaches of NATO members' airspace in 1 week. NATO basically doubling down in its condemnation against Russia for these aggressions. Let's say there is an escalation here, that Russia invades more airspace of more NATO members, or it goes back to Poland and Romania and threatens them more extensively.
Or a drone actually lands in,
exactly.
the territory of another country,
they actually
hitting a
fire
house.
into a territory. What happens for NATO as a body to take the conversation from Article 4 to Article 5?
So they would sit down quite quickly and invoke Article 5. It would be the second occasion, as we've said, since 1949. And they need consensus, really. They need all 32 members to agree that a military response is about to happen and what the nature of that response would look like.
Right.
And that's not something that we should presume is going to be easy to achieve. You have to remember that when the organization was established back in the 40s, there were 12.
Right.
Now it's 32. There are about 4 or 5 countries in Europe, including Ukraine, who want entry into NATO, so it could get even bigger. And I guess it theoretically means that any member could actually block action. And that could get complicated. One point to remember is the US and the US in all of this.
I was going to say, just because this is a military pact, it's not a political pact per se. It doesn't mean that all governments are aligned on the same agenda, and you can't ignore the US in that conversation.
No, so the US are not for Ukraine being in NATO. And the reason for that across many presidents, not just President Trump, both Democrat and Republican, is that they want to avoid a situation where American troops and Russian troops are facing off, because that's seen as kind of the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And so the fear there would be that if Ukraine was in NATO and then Ukraine got hit, the US would be obliged to go in and back them up. That would lead to a direct confrontation.
Yeah. But NATO has gotten bigger. We had Sweden join recently. Its membership has expanded. Finland as well joined, which increased the kind of NATO land border around Russia. But, Ukraine obviously has the very real and live threat of an ongoing conflict as we speak. Sam, where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? What happens next?
Well, I think we have some answers, but then we have some new questions. So the answer that we have is that NATO are ready to work together. And we saw that with some of the kind of combined fighter jet operations that were scattering the drones and responding in live time. Germany's being particularly present in those operations, same with the Netherlands. And Russia learned then that just flying a drone over those sorts of countries will lead to a response. So they kind of tested the line and perhaps put their toe a little bit over it in terms of a non-response. But the big question that is still there is how many violations, even if they're smaller ones, would actually count as an armed attack that requires Article 5.
When do you cross that line from hybrid operations to accidental or posturing moments to an offensive?
If it's 2 in a week, it's Article 4. Where is that line? Is it 10? Is it 20? Is it 3? We don't really know. It's not our job, you and I, to figure that one out. We'll leave it to the pros. But it's definitely a heightened temperature in that part of the world, more so than it was 7 days ago.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And as always, we will continue to keep a close eye on this one and cover it over on the Daily Aus feed as well as here on the podcast. Thank you, Sam, for taking us through that.
Thanks, Sam.
And thank you for listening to today's episode, or thanks for watching if you're over on our YouTube. We'll be back a little bit later with your evening news headlines. But until then, have a great day.